Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the very first garden. There, Adam and Eve walked in gentle light, without shame, without worry. A garden full of good trees and sweet fruit. A tree of the knowledge of good and evil. A cunning serpent. A forbidden fruit. A fateful fall. That is the opening chapter of humanity, a story most of us already know. A sacred beginning, followed by a fracture that plunged all of history into darkness. But what if I told you there's a part of the story that has never been told, or perhaps was told once, but has since been erased from our collective memory? The question is, could the Bible we hold in our hands be missing something essential? You are not the first to feel this way. For centuries, theologians, believers, and truth-seekers alike have asked, what is the full picture? And from within the forgotten scrolls of ancient times, a book has begun to resurface with increasing frequency, the Book of Jubilees. Also known as Little Genesis, the Book of Jubilees doesn't merely repeat the Book of Genesis, it redraws the entire sacred history with a completely different structure, not along a flat timeline, but by sacred cycles, not only from human memory, but based on the heavenly tablets, divine records where law, time, and destiny were inscribed before anything began. The Book of Jubilees reveals that angels were created on the very first day, that Adam and Eve lived 7 years in obedient light before their fall, that patriarchs like Enoch, Noah, and Abraham observed the Sabbath, offered sacrifices, and lived within the covenant, even before Moses ever received the law on Mount Sinai. If this is true, then what has been left out of the Bible we read today? And more importantly, why was it left out? No one denies the sacredness of Genesis. But if Jubilees was written alongside it, seen as a complementary light to Genesis, then why was it removed? And who decided that on your behalf? This isn't just a matter of religious history. It's an invitation to re-examine the full picture of faith, not just with your eyes, but with your soul. Because maybe you've never been shown the whole truth. And this book, it's waiting for you to reopen it. We often think that atop Mount Sinai, Moses received only the 10 Commandments and the law meant for Israel. But what if I told you that another book was also revealed on that holy mountain, a divine chronicle recorded by Moses himself under the guidance of angels? That book is called Jubilees, not a repetitive copy of Genesis, not a forged text written after the prophets, but a parallel revelation to the Torah, preserved only in the Ethiopian tradition, while the rest of Judaism and Christianity removed it from the official canon. Why? Because Jubilees does more than recount history from creation to Moses. It does something deeper. It connects every event to a sacred order that existed from the beginning. It shows that God did not just create the universe, but also established sacred time, divine law, and holy appointments right from the start. And all of this was inscribed on the heavenly tablets. In the Book of Jubilees, every major event in human history, from Adam's creation to Israel's exodus from Egypt, takes place exactly according to the preordained cycle of God. Time is not just a river that flows, it is the pulse of a divine rhythm, and those who do not live in that rhythm fall out of the covenant. The book also reveals that angels, especially the angels of the presence, accompanied Moses on the mountain, recording, explaining, and delivering divine law. There are things Moses was not taught among men, but were only revealed within the radiant light of heaven. So why was such a treasure cast out? Could it be because the book reached beyond the control of religious authorities? Because it didn't just speak of what humans must do, but unveiled a deeper order only visible to those within the covenant. Jubilees doesn't just tell stories, it unveils a metaphysical system. And for that very reason, it became dangerous to a religion that had reduced faith into mere ritual. If you've ever felt that something sacred has been lost, then perhaps you're hearing a whisper from a hidden book on the mountaintop. And this time, it's not coming to a prophet, it's coming to you. It wasn't because Jubilees lacked holiness that it was removed. Perhaps it was too holy, so much so that it threatened to shake the entire system of belief. Imagine this: if God's commandments about keeping the Sabbath, laws of purification, sacrificial rites and holy feasts had been taught since the time of Adam and practiced by Abraham, Isaac and Jacob centuries before Moses was born. What does that mean? It means the law was not a product of Sinai. It wasn't a temporary reaction to a stubborn people, not a phase meant to be replaced by grace. It was an eternal order, given from the beginning, written on heavenly tablets, taught by angels, and preserved by humans as part of a sacred covenant. This directly challenges traditional theology, especially the idea of unconditional grace in post-apostolic Christianity. If the patriarchs kept the law, if the law existed before the Jewish people did, then grace cannot be understood as a replacement for the law, but only as the empowerment to fulfill it completely. And that's why the Book of Jubilees became inconvenient. To some theologians, Jubilees is a threat because it blurs the lines between Old and New Testament, between law and grace, between Israel and the Church. It highlights an unchanging order, forcing people to re-examine the entire doctrinal system they once preached. To those who controlled the compilation of Scripture, this book could confuse believers, requiring a deeper and less manipulated way of reading the Bible. It touches something that every power structure fears, a truth that cannot be controlled. It's no surprise that Jubilees was rejected at the Jewish Council of Jamnia, ignored in the Greek Bibles, and preserved only by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, where the tradition of keeping the law and observing the feasts was never separated from the faith. The question isn't just who hid it. It is, what were they afraid of if this truth were revealed? If you've ever heard a sermon declaring that everything has been made new, maybe it's time you revisit Jubilees and realize that God didn't create a new law. He's restoring what existed from the beginning, and whoever enters into that law will live in the very rhythm of the covenant. You've read the book of Genesis, a sacred beginning. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But have you ever asked, the beginning of what? The beginning of the physical world, of mankind, or of the very sacred flow that existed even before? Genesis is like a simplified map, painting the journey of creation with bold but basic strokes. But Jubilees, it's like a hidden layer beneath the map, where sacred timelines, unchanging laws, and the presence of angels create a deeper and more astonishing picture. For example, Genesis tells us that in 6 days God created the universe, but Jubilees adds, on the first day, the angels were created. They weren't just silent figures appearing in visions later. They were present from the very beginning, playing roles of guardianship, instruction, and heavenly calendar keepers. Genesis speaks of time in linear fashion: first day, second day, and then the seventh day as the Sabbath. But Jubilees reveals the Sabbath is not merely a day of rest, but the sacred heartbeat of the universe, established on the heavenly tablets, preserved by angels and gifted to mankind as a lifestyle aligned with heaven. Genesis gives us images of Adam, Cain, Noah, Abraham as individual moral figures. Jubilees shows us they were taught divine ordinances, observed purification rituals, built altars, and lived according to what was preordained in the sacred calendar. Genesis tells us events. Jubilees uncovers the depth within them. Genesis describes actions. Jubilees reveals the sacred meanings behind them. And notably, Genesis says nothing about the 364-day calendar, a perfect structure of time, 4 seasons, each with 91 days, overseen by angels. This calendar ensures that Sabbaths and holy festivals always fall on the exact same day each year, a sacred rhythm, never out of sync with heaven. Yet most of us have never heard this, because Jubilees was removed, and because we've grown used to living on the surface, forgetting that the iceberg holds far more beneath than what is seen above. If Genesis is the curriculum for those beginning the journey of faith, then Jubilees is the whisper for those called to live the fullness of the covenant. The question is, which book are you reading? And which part of the truth are you living? We often think the law, the commandments, the purity codes, the Sabbath, the offerings, began with Moses. That only at Mount Sinai, with stone tablets and fire from heaven, did mankind first receive the law of God. But the Book of Jubilees says otherwise. Moses did not originate the law. He merely recorded what had once been forgotten. The law existed before, since the days of Adam, the very first man. From the time when God still walked in the garden among men and angels. Jubilees recounts that Adam was taught about purity and knew how to keep both body and soul in holiness. That Abel knew how to offer a proper sacrifice, which is why his offering was accepted, unlike Cain's. That Noah, after the great flood, presented a clean sacrifice with the right quantity and the correct manner. Who taught him to do that? That Abraham, before any stone tablets ever existed, kept the Sabbath, circumcised his descendants, and followed commandments which, according to Jubilees, were written on the heavenly tablets. And here is something even more astonishing. The angels also kept the law. They observed the Sabbath. They offered sacrifices. They followed the sacred calendar. And the very law they followed is the same law given to humanity. So here's the question. If Adam knew the law, if Noah kept the law, if Abraham lived by the law, then did the law really begin with Moses? Or was Moses merely the chosen vessel to rekindle the flame of the covenant that had burned since the beginning? If this is true, then our entire understanding of salvation history must be rewritten. The law was never just for the Jewish people. The law is the sacred rhythm that sounded from creation, guarded by angels, passed down by the patriarchs, and then forgotten, dimmed, and removed. And if that's the case, then grace is not the replacement of the law, but the light shining again upon what was lost. The Book of Jubilees does not come to add more laws, but to awaken memory. not to force us into a mold, but to remind us that the soul once knew how to live in harmony with heaven. Have you ever felt a distant sense of the sacred within you, as if you had once known, once kept, once lived in it? Maybe you don't need to learn more. You just need to remember. We often think of time as a linear flow, from past to present to future, with years and months and events lining up in sequence. But Jubilees unveils a different truth. Time, in God's eyes, does not flow. It turns, not a straight line, but a sacred cycle, established from the very beginning of creation. According to Jubilees, God did not only create heaven and earth, but also established time itself as a part of the cosmic order. And that time is measured by a unique calendar, 364 days per year, divided evenly into 52 perfect weeks, 4 seasons, each with 91 days, nothing more, nothing less. This is not just a technical detail. This is a cosmic revelation. That calendar wasn't invented by man, but written on the heavenly tablets, watched over by angels, to ensure that each season, each feast, each Sabbath happens at the exact appointed time, like the breath of the heavens. And deeper still, time isn't only marked by years, but by cycles of 49 years, known as the Jubilee cycle. Every 7 times 7 years comes a Jubilee year, a year of freedom, forgiveness, restoration, a year when the land rests, slaves are freed, and debts are erased. That's why in Jubilees, every major event in salvation history, from creation to the fall to the flood to the covenant with Abraham, happens at the appointed time. Not by accident, not driven by political events, but as a reflection of a deeper divine order. While humans live in time like a rainstorm falling aimlessly, God, in Jubilees, dwells within the perfect circle of sacred rhythm. And when mankind strays from the holy calendar, they begin to fall out of sync with God's order. The shifting of feast days, the forgetting of the Sabbath, the distortion of seasons. These are not just calendar errors, they are symptoms of disconnection from God Himself. Thus, the Book of Jubilees does not merely retell history, it remeasures the soul of humanity. If you've ever felt like you're living out of rhythm, adrift, as if time moves but your soul stands still, perhaps your problem is not your plan, but your timing. Stop, listen. Perhaps the bell of the sacred calendar is ringing, calling you back into the original cycle. When we think of Eden, we often imagine a brief beginning, Adam, Eve, the forbidden fruit, and a fall that came like a passing breeze. But Jubilees tells a different story, a story longer, deeper, and bathed in light. According to this book, Adam and Eve did not sin immediately after being created. They did not enter human life through failure, but through light. The first 7 years in the Garden of Eden were years of light, peace, and divine instruction. They were not alone. They were taught by angels not only how to live, but about the laws of purification, holiness, and the meaning of the covenant between man and God. Eden, therefore, was not a place of carefree fantasy or a dreamlike garden as often imagined. Eden, according to Jubilees, was a place of sacred training, the first temple, a place where humans were prepared to live as priests of creation, and they lived accordingly until the 8th year. It was in that year that darkness crept in, not by force, but by whisper. Satan did not invade by strength, but by distorting the covenant. The fall did not happen in an instant, but was the result of delayed vigilance, of a soul beginning to forget that it once walked with God. If we see Eden only as a starting point, we miss its sacred and living nature. Eden was not merely where the fall happened, but a model of living in God's design. It shows us mankind can live in light if it keeps the covenant, if it walks in the rhythm of divine law. But when Eden was forgotten, the truth was forgotten with it, and we began to retell the origin story as though it were only a failure. Jubilees whispers, "No, the light endured, and you too can live in that light again." Perhaps Eden never closed, but merely retreated into sacred memory, waiting for a soul quiet enough to remember. In the shadows of human history, there is a chapter unmentioned in familiar sermons, a chapter that Jubilees paints clearly, shockingly, and with spiritual weight. The first rebellion did not begin on earth, but in heaven itself. The watcher angels, those sent by God, were not at first enemies of humanity. On the contrary, they were entrusted to observe, protect, and guide mankind according to the sacred covenant. They were the bridge between heaven and earth, messengers from the realm of light. But in their watching, they were drawn in. They became enamored by what they saw, especially human women, and they chose to love in a way that did not belong to heaven. And that was the beginning of the fall. Jubilees describes how the Watchers abandoned their stations, united with earthly women, and from that union was born a strange hybrid race, the Nephilim, giants, half divine, half human, with the power of angels but the corrupted hearts of men. The Nephilim were not merely massive beings. They were symbols of departure from the divine order. They brought violence, chaos, and unbridled ambition. They dominated, destroyed, and defiled the earth and the human bloodline. But it didn't end there. The Watchers also brought forbidden knowledge, sorcery, weapon-making, seductive arts, astrology. What seemed like progress was really the exchange of souls for power, a severing of the bond between man and creator. The world became morally bankrupt and biologically corrupt. And because of this, God acted through the great flood, not out of wrath, but to restore the order of creation. The story of the Watchers is not mere mythology. It's a lens for us to understand the deeper origins of evil, of the soul's deviation from the divine pattern. And it is also a warning. Not everything that comes from the heavens is light. Some fallen beings still bear angelic form, but have traded light for rebellion. Jubilees unveils a chilling truth. The war between light and darkness did not begin in Eden. It began in the heavens, and we, though small, are still living in the aftershocks of that war. We often hear that the Patriarchs, from Abel to Abraham, were righteous men, pleasing to God. But Jubilees goes further than that. They were not simply good men at heart. They were keepers of the fire of the covenant, the fire of sacred laws written on the heavenly tablets, long before Moses was born, long before Israel even existed. Look again at Abel, the first to offer a sacrifice accepted by God. In Jubilees, this was not an emotional act. Abel followed proper ritual at the appointed time in the correct manner, like a priest who knew the law of offerings. Then Seth and Enosh, not merely Adam's descendants by blood. They preserved the holy ordinances, distinguished sacred days, organized communities, and recorded what had been passed down from the angels. Enoch, who the Bible says was taken up, appears in Jubilees as the first great prophet, the one who held the heavenly calendar, decoded time, and warned humanity of the coming judgment. He lived by heaven's cycle, untouched by the corruption unleashed by the watchers, and Abraham often praised for his faith. But Jubilees reveals another dimension. He was a teacher of the law. He kept the Sabbath, discerned clean from unclean food, established rules for his household, and passed them to Isaac, not as personal inspiration, but as a sacred inheritance. All of these people, they lived according to the law, not because they were forced to, but because they saw something we have forgotten. God did not wait until Sinai to give the law. The law existed from the dawn of creation. It is the breath of the universe, the structure of the divine order. And those who lived by that law were the ones who preserved life, who preserved light in an age when the darkness of the watchers had flooded the earth. If today you examine your life, ask yourself, are you living by emotion, by habit, or by a sacred rhythm that has long been forgotten? Because maybe you weren't only called to believe, but to preserve what was once written in heaven. Abel was not simply someone who offered a pleasing sacrifice, as we often hear. In Jubilees, his action was not a spontaneous instinct, but an obedience to a sacrificial law that had been taught from heaven. From the very beginning, after Adam and Eve left Eden, the angels, especially the angel of the presence, delivered basic laws regarding offerings, purity, holy days, and how to live within the covenant. Abel grew up in that atmosphere, and when it came time to make his offering, he wasn't impulsive nor guessing. He followed what had been taught. And Abel offered from the firstborn of his flock, from the best of their fat, and God looked with favor upon his offering. Jubilees 4:3, paraphrased translation. In contrast, Cain, though a farmer, did not follow the laws of sacrifice. He gave fruit of the ground casually, not at the appointed time, not in the prescribed manner. This wasn't simply a difference of profession. It was the contrast between someone living within the divine law and someone acting by his own will. And it was this disobedience that stirred Cain's anger and led him to murder his brother. A crime not rooted in violence, but in the rejection of sacred law. From the very beginning, Jubilees declares, there are two lines, one that keeps the law and one that breaks it. And the first human conflict was not over land, power, or wealth, but over the act of sacrifice. What does that mean? It means the law didn't begin in Moses' time. It already existed, and the righteous were those who lived in step with it, like Abel. If today we wish to re-enter the covenant, perhaps we need to ask, the way we live, the way we worship, the way we offer our hearts, are they in harmony with a divine order, or are we crafting a religion of our own design? The story of Abel does not end with his death. It begins a quiet warning. To live outside the law is to step outside the gaze of God. In many people's minds, the Great Flood is a terrifying image. God's absolute judgment, the destruction of the earth because of sin. But if we look from the lens of Jubilees, another truth emerges. The flood was not merely punishment, it was a ritual of cleansing. Before the flood, the sacred order had been overturned. The Nephilim sowed destruction. Humanity descended into chaos, devouring one another. Morality was corrupted. The covenant was broken. And as light faded from the face of the earth, God did not abandon creation. He cleansed it. The waters covered, not to erase all things, but to purify. like a baptism for the entire planet. Noah was not just a survivor, he was a keeper of the covenant. The first thing he did after exiting the ark was not till the land or build a house, but build an altar. And Noah offered burnt offerings from clean animals, and the aroma rose to God. And God renewed the covenant with Noah and his sons. Jubilees 6:3-5. That moment was not just a new beginning. It was a ceremony restoring the covenant that had existed since Adam. The laws of sacrifice, holy days, and the sacred calendar were all reaffirmed. The angel reminded Noah to remember every detail. There was no gap between Adam and Moses, no absence of law. There were people like Noah who lived by that law, kept it, and passed it on. And when the waters receded, it wasn't just dry land that emerged. A new order was re-established, a world purified, so it could once again align with heaven's original rhythm. And the question becomes, if the Great Flood was a ritual, then is our own era in need of an inner cleansing? Could the chaos of today be a sign that we've strayed from the sacred calendar, from the covenant, from the divine cycle of light? Noah is not merely a historical figure. He is a model of the one chosen, not to escape the flood, but to live rightly after it. The Bible mentions the Nephilim, but only briefly, vaguely, as if they were some distant myth. But in the Book of Jubilees, the appearance of the Nephilim is no side note. It is a metaphysical fracture, a breaking point in the sacred structure of the world. It all began with angels sent to guard the earth, called the Watchers. They were given a high mission to preserve order and guide humanity in the divine law. But then they saw the beauty of human women, and desire awoke. They abandoned their positions. They united with earthly women, and from that union the Nephilim were born. Beings with mortal flesh, but the power of the heavens. Giants not just in size, but in brutality. Not merely conquerors, but distorters of human nature itself. They weren't just physical rulers. They taught humanity forbidden things. How to forge weapons. How to enchant with beauty. How to practice magic and manipulate souls. Sin was no longer personal failure, but became a system. An organized, instructed, and reinforced structure. A current pulling all of humanity away from the covenant. Jubilees describes, all flesh began to eat each other. No boundaries remained between man and beast, between angel and human, between sacred and profane. This wasn't just an age of violence. This was the distortion of light. It was when the holiest things became tools for darkness. And in that context, God was compelled to rebuild the world, not because he hated creation, but because he loved it and would not let it be twisted beyond redemption. The Nephilim are not mere legends. They are a warning of what happens when the divine order is overturned. And if today we're still swept up in violence, seduction, and the thirst for power, could it be that the breath of the Nephilim still lingers, hidden in the modern world and even in the smallest decisions of every soul? We often think of sin as wrong behaviors, lying, stealing, violence, adultery. But the Book of Jubilees does not stop at outward symptoms. It goes deeper into the unseen essence, where sin is no longer a single act, but a deviation from the spiritual order, from the divine design God ordained at the beginning of creation. In Jubilees, all of creation does not merely exist, it exists according to a structure, a sacred blueprint written on the heavenly tablets. There, not only moral laws exist, but time, festivals, light frequencies, spiritual rhythms, all established and maintained by God and His angels. The world does not move in chaos. It operates like a hymn where every soul is invited to join in harmony. And sin begins when someone falls out of rhythm, when humanity forgets the 364-day calendar watched by the angels, forgets the Sabbath, neglects purification rituals, and ignores the laws of offerings. That is not just disobedience. It is a severing from the breath of heaven. And from there, people begin to set time by their own measure, invent morality by their own standards, call wrong right, and turn law into preference. This misalignment spreads like an undercurrent, causing entire societies, even civilizations, to lose direction. In the book, the angels warn, when mankind no longer lives by the sacred festivals, they will fall into chaos. Holy times will be overturned, sacred days will be forgotten, and the promises will be broken. Sin, then, is not merely law-breaking, it is structural collapse of the soul, when you, even with good intentions, step into a realm no longer illuminated by God. No one sees this misalignment with the naked eye, but its effects are clear. Loss of direction, blurred morality, evil spreading as normality. And deep within, the soul no longer hears the voice of God. The Book of Jubilees does not merely say, "Don't do wrong." It says, "Live by the rhythm of heaven." Because when you live out of sync with the sacred rhythm, you don't just break the law, you live a life no longer within the covenant. The final question is not, am I right or wrong, but, am I still within the order God wrote for me from the beginning? If not, then perhaps that is the greatest sin of all. We live in time, but very few people ask, is the time I'm living in the right one? Not the right hour, but the right rhythm. Right with whom? With the one who designed time from the very beginning. The Book of Jubilees presents a shocking answer. Time is not a human invention. It is a divine order established by God from the first day of creation. God did not only create the universe, He ordained time. He set in place a heavenly calendar written on the heavenly tablets and assigned angels to guard it. That calendar has 364 days, divided into 4 seasons, each with 91 days, each year holding 52 perfect weeks. No short months, no excess days, no need for adjustments. No drifting. Why is this so important? Because every sacred event, from creation to the covenant, to the Sabbath, to the holy festivals, even to the day of the Messiah's appearance, was scheduled according to this cycle, not by chance, but at the appointed time, in the appointed season, on the day written on the tablets of heaven. Jubilees affirms, when mankind lives according to the heavenly calendar, they remain in the covenant. But when they abandon it, everything begins to fall out of place. And humanity did abandon it. They chased after the lunar calendar, a cycle that is uneven, causing sacred days to drift. Feasts no longer aligned with holy days. The Sabbath was forgotten or shifted. And gradually, people lost connection with the rhythm of God. When time is out of sync, behavior follows. When feasts are forsaken, the soul loses its orientation. When the calendar is changed, the very order of the cosmos begins to tremble. In the vision of Jubilees, time is not merely for counting age, but for measuring faithfulness. Not simply how much time has passed, but are you still living in the sacred season? If you keep that rhythm, you walk in the light. If you forget, you've strayed off the map of the covenant. The question is not, what year is it now, but rather, are you living in God's time or just chasing after man's calendar? Perhaps it is time we reset the clock of the soul. Amid the pages of ancient books, where law, calendar, and angels interweave, the Book of Jubilees doesn't only speak of the past, it points forward to a person, to a figure. Not a patriarch, not a prophet, but the Anointed One, the one who will keep the law perfectly, live by the heavenly calendar, and restore the original covenant between heaven and earth. Jubilees does not name him, does not describe his appearance. It simply says he will arrive at the appointed time, written on the heavenly tablets during a Jubilee cycle in a holy festival season. He will not abolish the law, but fulfill it through his very life. Not obscure the old covenant, but revive the original rhythm between God and humanity. He is described as light in the midst of darkness, rhythm in the chaos, eternal word amid forgetfulness. In a world of confusion, where fallen angels have sown war, where humanity is lost, where time is distorted and the law forgotten, his arrival is the sign that God has not abandoned his creation. Jubilees whispers, he will come, and he will live in full accordance with what has been written. Every season, every day, every law, he will uphold, and he will bring humanity back into alignment, back into the covenant, back into the light. And we realize this is Jesus Christ. He did not abolish the law. He embodied it. He did not merely preach the gospel. He lived the covenant in flesh and blood. He is the embodiment of the sacred calendar, the living Sabbath, the heavenly tablets written in flesh and mercy. Jubilees doesn't preach the gospel, but it paves the road for it. A road through the law, through the calendar, through the angels, leading us to the Son. He did not come only to save. He came to reset the clock of our souls, to bring us back into the divine rhythm. And from that moment, once again, the order of the universe is restored within the heart of one who longs for truth. Imagine holding a sheet of music, but half the notes are missing, an ancient map, but the borders are torn, a sacred vow, but the listener has forgotten the beginning. The Bible, without Jubilees, Enoch, and the Watchers, is a symphony torn in half. And what we've lost is not just text. We've lost the heavenly tablets, where all sacred laws were written at the dawn of creation. We've lost the 364-day calendar, the divine timekeeper for both time and soul. We've lost the guardian angels, those who stood between humanity and the infinite. We've lost the spiritual depth, where law is not just a rule, but the living flow between heaven and earth. Without Jubilees, the story of salvation becomes a fragment, not a full picture. The law becomes Judaism, the Sabbath becomes a habit, the sacred calendar becomes tradition, and time, which was the heartbeat of heaven, is replaced by the Roman calendar, lunar cycles, or a modern pace that has no space for the soul. Worse still, we lose awareness that there is a sacred order all around us. When Jubilees was removed, along with Enoch, giants, and the testament of the 12 Patriarchs, the theological axis of the covenant began to shake. We're left with a Bible edited to fit doctrine, but lacking the view from heaven. Is this why the modern world finds the Bible shallow? Because once we had that depth, and with our own hands we tore it away. No one erased the law. No one denied God. We simply cut away the things that made the law alive, the pages that held together law, calendar, and soul. And in the haunting silence of the banned books, perhaps we still hear a whisper. When you forget God's time, you lose your direction. Have you ever felt that the Bible was missing something? Not because you doubt your faith, but because your soul remembers the part that was hidden. There are books no longer found in our Bibles, but they have never truly fallen silent. They don't shout, they don't argue, they don't demand to be reinstated. They only whisper in the hearts of those who still hear the sacred call of the forgotten. Jubilees, Enoch, Book of the Watchers. These texts were not cast aside for being meaningless, but because they spoke of things religious systems could not control. They spoke of angels, not as symbols, but as living beings. They redrew the heavenly order, where time, law, angels, and humanity moved together in a divine dance. They retold history, not just of Israel, but of the soul of mankind. Perhaps you've heard them, not through your ears, but as a trembling within. A moment when reading the Bible, and you wondered, something here feels missing. A time you looked at the Sabbath and felt it was more than a rule, a sunset where time felt not just like ours, but a gateway between heaven and earth. That is no coincidence. That may be the whisper of those silenced pages, searching for someone who can still listen. These words are not for the masses, not for the hurried, not for those who treat faith as a moral system, but for awakened souls, for those who remember something they never learned, but their spirit always knew. For those ready to hear heaven's rhythm again and reset their soul's calendar. Do you hear it? Not with your ears, but in the trembling of something you've never named, but know is real. If you do, then maybe you're not just watching this video, maybe you are being called to live the missing pages of the Bible, pages long forgotten. From Eden, where everything began in light. From Adam's first footprint on sacred ground, from Eve's first tear shed in the garden, a flame was lit. It burned through Abel, the one who offered rightly. It passed through Seth, Enosh, and Enoch, who walked with God until he no longer belonged to this world. It blazed in Abraham, who smashed idols, kept the Sabbath, and lived before God as if the law was already written in his soul. And then, that flame seemed to dim, because humanity forgot, because we assumed sacred history was past, because we believed the law began only at Sinai, and everything before was just myth. But the light never went out. It simply hid beneath the ash of forgotten centuries, hidden in the banned pages, the unsung heavenly scrolls, the unnamed angels, hidden in your own soul, where something still remembers the original rhythm of creation. The Book of Jubilees doesn't come to tell a fairy tale. It doesn't ask you to look back, but to look deep, not to read, but to listen. Not to say believe, but to whisper, remember. Because the covenant was never lost. It is still there, in the rotation of the sun, in the steadiness of the seasons, in the breath of those who keep the Sabbath as the sun goes down. If something stirred in your heart, that's not information, that's a calling. And maybe you're not just hearing this story. Maybe you've been awakened to rekindle the light that seemed to fade, because that light is the part of you that has always belonged. You can continue as before. Wake up, work, grow weary, sleep, and repeat, as if time is just a sequence of numbers, as if holy days are just holidays, as if you have nothing to do with what was once written on the heavenly tablets at the dawn of creation. Or you can pause, take a deep breath, and listen to heaven's rhythm, the rhythm that Jubilees is now whispering into your soul. Keep one day each week, not out of obligation, but because you remember you belong to a higher order, no longer moving to the pace of the world, but walking in the sacred cycle, not letting time carry you, but letting the covenant guide you home. Because if something in this video stirred you, if any part left you silent, if any moment gave you chills, then maybe you're not just a viewer. You're not just hearing a story. You are being called, not to teach others, not to become wise, but to keep the fire in a world forgetting the original light. Set the sacred calendar again over your life. Live slowly. Live in rhythm. Live as if you are part of a great covenant that continues with every step you take. Because those who hear this call, it's not by accident, and the flame needs only one keeper to burn again. Amen.